The Widow's Secret, a tale of love, loss, and mystery. The discovery, the dusty attic of the old Victorian mansion on Elm Street had remained untouched for decades. When estate attorney Margaret Chen climbed the creaking wooden stairs in October 2023, she expected to find nothing more than forgotten furniture and moth-eaten clothing. The Blackwood estate had been tied up in legal proceedings for years, and she was finally conducting the inventory that would allow the property to be sold. Margaret's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs that hung like tattered curtains from the rafters. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, their contents a mystery waiting to be unveiled. As she moved deeper into the attic, her foot caught on a loose floorboard, sending her stumbling forward. Her hand shot out to steady herself against a nearby trunk, and as she did, the old leather case toppled over, spilling its contents across the dusty floor. Photographs scattered like fallen leaves, their sepia tones catching the light. Margaret knelt down to gather them, but one image made her freeze. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at what appeared to be an impossible scene, a woman in 1920s attire, standing beside three coffins, each bearing a different nameplate, each containing what appeared to be a different man. The photograph was dated 1921, and written on the back, in faded ink, were the words, Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife, to all three. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had scrawled, "The truth must never be told." Margaret's hands trembled as she examined the photograph more closely. The woman in the image was strikingly beautiful, with dark hair styled in the fashion of the era and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. But it was the expression on her face that disturbed Margaret most. There was no grief there, no sorrow. Instead, Eleanor Blackwood appeared almost satisfied. But what Margaret discovered next would change everything she thought she knew about the Blackwood family. The shocking truth behind this 1921 photograph was just the beginning. As Margaret continued to sift through the scattered photographs, she found more images of Eleanor with different men, all appearing to be from different time periods within the same decade. Wedding photographs, intimate portraits, and formal family pictures, each featuring Eleanor with a different husband. The dates on the photographs told a disturbing story: 3 marriages, 3 deaths, all within the span of 5 years. Margaret's legal mind began to race. She had handled many estate cases, but nothing like this. The implications were staggering. If these photographs were authentic, they suggested that Eleanor Blackwood had been married to 3 different men, all of whom had died under circumstances that would have certainly warranted investigation in any era. She carefully gathered all the photographs and placed them back in the leather case, her mind already formulating the questions that needed answers. Who was Eleanor Blackwood? How had 3 husbands died in such a short span of time? And most importantly, why had this evidence been hidden away in an attic for over a century? The wind outside picked up, causing the old house to creak and groan around her. Margaret shivered, suddenly aware of how alone she was in this place that had harbored such dark secrets. She made her way back down the attic stairs, the leather case clutched tightly in her hands, knowing that she held the key to a mystery that had been buried for far too long. The mansion itself seemed to whisper its secrets as Margaret descended the stairs. Each step echoed through the empty halls, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's presence still lingered in these rooms. The wallpaper, though faded and peeling, still bore traces of elegant patterns that spoke of wealth and refinement. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their surfaces dulled by decades of dust, but still hinting at their former grandeur. Margaret paused in what had once been the main parlor, imagining Eleanor entertaining guests here, playing the role of the grieving widow while secretly planning her next move. The room would have been filled with flowers sent by sympathetic friends, and Eleanor would have received visitors who came to offer their condolences and support. How many of those well-meaning people had unknowingly aided a killer by providing her with alibis and character references? The realization that Eleanor had operated in plain sight, protected by society's expectations and her own carefully crafted image, sent another chill down Margaret's spine. This was not a case of a criminal hiding in the shadows. This was someone who had used respectability itself as a weapon. Margaret spent the next 3 days poring over public records at the county courthouse, trying to piece together Eleanor Blackwood's story. What she discovered painted a picture of a woman who had lived multiple lives, each more mysterious than the last. Eleanor's first marriage was to Thomas Ashford, a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune in the textile industry. The marriage certificate, dated March 15 to the showed that Eleanor was just 19 years old at the time. Thomas was 42, a widower with no children who had apparently been swept off his feet by the young woman's beauty and charm. The newspaper archives revealed that Thomas Ashford had been a prominent figure in the community, known for his philanthropy and business acumen. His textile mills employed hundreds of workers, and he was considered one of the most eligible of bachelors in the state before his marriage to Eleanor. The society pages of the local newspaper had covered their wedding extensively, describing it as the social event of the season. But Thomas Ashford's life took a dramatic turn after his marriage. Within months of the wedding, his business began to suffer. Workers reported that he seemed distracted and unwell, often leaving important meetings early to rush home to his young wife. His business partners grew concerned about his erratic behavior and his increasing reliance on Eleanor's judgment in matters that had previously been his sole domain. Margaret found the death certificate dated September 10. The cause of death was listed as acute gastric distress, a vague term that could have covered anything from food poisoning to deliberate poisoning. What struck Margaret as particularly odd was that Thomas had been a healthy, robust man with no history of stomach ailment. The newspaper obituary painted a picture of a man who had died tragically young, leaving behind a grieving widow who was too overcome with emotion to speak to reporters. Eleanor had inherited Thomas's entire estate, including his textile mills, his mansion, and his considerable investments. For a 19-year-old girl from modest circumstances, it was a fortune beyond imagination. But perhaps most disturbing was what Margaret found in the probative records. Thomas Ashford had changed his will just 2 weeks before his death, leaving everything to Eleanor and cutting out the distant relatives who had been his previous beneficiaries. The will had been witnessed by Eleanor's personal physician, Marcus Whitmore, a man whose name would appear again in Margaret's investigation. Margaret stared at the documents spread across her desk, trying to make sense of the timeline. Eleanor had gone from being a poor girl to a wealthy widow in less than 6 months. The speed of Thomas's decline and death, combined with the convenient timing of the will change, raised red flags that would have triggered a thorough investigation in modern times. But this was 1918, and Eleanor Blackwood was a beautiful young widow who had captured the sympathy of the entire community. No one questioned her story of a loving husband who had succumbed to a sudden illness. No one investigated the circumstances surrounding Thomas Ashford's rapid decline. And no one thought to examine the role that Dr. Marcus Whitmore might have played in the tragedy. As Margaret closed the file on Thomas Ashford, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at the first act of a carefully orchestrated drama. Eleanor Blackwood had learned valuable lessons from her first marriage, lessons that she would put to devastating use in the years to come. The more Margaret delved into Thomas's background, the more she understood why Eleanor had chosen him as her first victim. Thomas had been isolated, having lost his first wife to tuberculosis 3 years earlier. He had no children, no close family members who might have questioned Eleanor's motives or monitored their relationship closely. His wealth was substantial, but not so vast as to attract the attention of fortune hunters, at least not obviously. Eleanor had approached Thomas through the local church, where she had volunteered to help with charitable activities. The pastor's records, which Margaret found in the church archives, showed that Eleanor had been particularly attentive to widowed members of the congregation, offering to help with household tasks and providing companionship during their time of grief. It was a perfect hunting ground for someone with Eleanor's intentions. The church records also revealed that Eleanor had been remarkably knowledgeable about business matters for someone of her age and background. She had offered valuable advice to Thomas about his investments and had suggested ways to modernize his textile operations. This expertise had impressed Thomas and had made him increasingly dependent on her counsel, setting the stage for her eventual control over his finances. Margaret discovered that Eleanor had been particularly interested in Thomas's will from early in their relationship. She had expressed concern about what would happen to his workers and his charitable commitments if something were to happen to him. This apparent selflessness had touched Thomas deeply and had made him more receptive to Eleanor's suggestions about updating his estate planning. The transformation of Thomas from a successful businessman to a confused and sickly man had been gradual but unmistakable. His business associates had noted that he had become increasingly forgetful and had begun making poor decisions that were completely out of character. Some had attributed this to the stress of his new marriage, while others had wondered if he was suffering from some form of early dementia. What was particularly chilling was that Eleanor had documented Thomas's decline in letters to friends and family, creating a written record of his supposed illness that would later serve as evidence of her devoted care. These letters, which Margaret found in the estate papers, painted a picture of a loving wife struggling to care for a husband whose health was mysteriously failing. Eleanor's performance as the grieving widow had been flawless. She had worn black for a full year, had refused all social invitations, and had spoken movingly about her late husband's kindness and generosity. The community had rallied around her, offering support and friendship that would prove invaluable in her future endeavors. Armed with the knowledge of Eleanor's first marriage, Margaret delved deeper into the records, searching for evidence of the second husband referenced in the mysterious photograph. What she found was a pattern so methodical and calculated that it sent chills down her spine. Eleanor's second marriage took place on June 2019, less than a year after Thomas Ashford's death. Her new husband was Dr. Marcus Whitmore, the very physician who had witnessed Thomas's will and attended to him during his final illness. The irony was not lost on Margaret. Eleanor had married the man who had been present during her first husband's death. Dr. Whitmore was a respected physician in his 50s, known for his work with the city's elite families. He had never married, dedicating his life to his medical practice and his research into new treatments for various ailments. According to the society pages, his courtship of the young widow had been brief but intense, with their engagement announced just 3 months after they began seeing each other. The wedding was a more subdued affair than Eleanor's first, which was appropriate given her recent widowhood. However, the guest list is read like a who's who of the city's most prominent families. Eleanor had clearly used her position as Thomas Ashford's widow to establish herself in high society, and her marriage to Dr. Whitmore only solidified her status. Margaret found it particularly interesting that Dr. Whitmore had been instrumental in helping Eleanor manage Thomas Ashford's business interests during her brief widowhood. He had advised her on which investments to keep and which to liquidate, and under his guidance she had actually increased her wealth considerably. It seemed that Eleanor had a natural talent for business, or perhaps she was simply very good at choosing advisors who could help her achieve her goals. The shocking truth about Dr. Whitmore's death would reveal Eleanor's true nature, and the photograph from 1922 was about to expose the most disturbing pattern of all. Dr. Whitmore's death came on February 4, Valentine's Day, a detail that Margaret found grimly ironic. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, which seemed plausible for a man in his 50s. However, the circumstances surrounding his death were remarkably similar to those of Thomas Ashford. According to the newspaper reports, Whitmore had been in excellent health until the final weeks of his life. Colleagues noted that he had seemed increasingly fatigued and complained of chest pains, but he had attributed these symptoms to the stress of his demanding practice. On the morning of February 14th, Eleanor had found him collapsed in his study, apparently having suffered a massive heart attack while reviewing patient files. What made Margaret suspicious was the timing of Dr. Whitmore's will change. Just like Thomas Ashford, he had modified his will shortly before his death, leaving his entire estate to Eleanor. The previous version of his will had left his wealth to various medical charities and research institutions. The new will, dated January 20, 1920, just 2 weeks before his death, made Eleanor his sole beneficiary. The probate records showed that Dr. Whitmore's estate was even more substantial than Thomas Ashford's had been. In addition to his successful medical practice, he had invested wisely in real estate and stocks. Eleanor inherited not only his wealth, but also his impressive collection of medical books and equipment, which she promptly sold to other physicians in the area. Margaret noticed another disturbing pattern. Both men had died at home, with Eleanor as the only witness. Both had changed their wills shortly before their deaths, and both had been attended by the same physician during their final illnesses. In Thomas's case, it had been Whitmore himself, and in Dr. Whitmore's case, it had been his colleague, Dr. James Morrison. As Margaret researched Dr. Morrison, she discovered that he had been a close friend of Dr. Whitmore's and had been present at Eleanor's wedding to the doctor. The medical community was small and tightly knit, and it seemed that Eleanor had managed to ingratiate herself with several prominent physicians who could be useful to her purposes. The newspaper coverage of Whitmore's death was sympathetic to Eleanor, portraying her as a tragic figure who had lost 2 husbands in less than 2 years. The community rallied around her, offering support and companionship during her time of grief. No one questioned the remarkable coincidence of 2 healthy men dying so soon after marrying the same woman. No one investigated the suspicious timing of the will changes, and no one thought to examine the medical records more closely. Margaret realized that Eleanor had refined her technique with her second marriage. She had learned from her experience with Thomas Ashford and had chosen her next victim more carefully. Whitmore's medical knowledge and connections had made him valuable to her, both as a husband and as a source of information about how to make deaths appear natural and unsuspicious. The courtship between Eleanor and Dr. Whitmore had been a masterclass in manipulation. Eleanor had presented herself as a woman struggling to understand her late husband's business affairs, seeking Dr. Whitmore's advice as a trusted family friend. She had gradually shifted their relationship from professional to personal, always maintaining the appearance of propriety while slowly drawing him into her web. Dr. Whitmore's colleagues later recalled that he had seemed happier than they had ever seen him during his brief marriage to Eleanor. He had spoken often of his young wife's intelligence and compassion, and had credited her with helping him find balance between his work and personal life. The tragic irony was that the woman he believed was bringing him happiness was actually planning his destruction. Eleanor's behavior during Dr. Whitmore's final illness had been exemplary by all accounts. She had nursed him devotedly, had consulted with other physicians about his condition, and had spared no expense in trying to find treatments for his mysterious symptoms. Her performance had been so convincing that even Dr. Morrison, who would later harbor suspicions about her, had initially praised her dedication and care. The timing of Dr. Whitmore's death had been particularly advantageous for Eleanor. Valentine's Day provided a romantic context that made his sudden death seem even more tragic and poetic. The community's sympathy for Eleanor reached new heights, and any questions about the circumstances of his death were quickly dismissed as inappropriate given her obvious grief. Eleanor's inheritance of Dr. Whitmore's medical library had given her access to detailed information about diseases, symptoms, and treatments that would prove invaluable in her future crimes. She had studied these books carefully, gaining knowledge that would help her refine her methods and make her subsequent murders even more difficult to detect. The sale of Dr. Whitmore's medical equipment to other physicians had served multiple purposes. It had provided Eleanor with additional income, had helped her establish relationships with other members of the medical community, and had created the impression that she was too grief-stricken to keep reminders of her late husband's profession. In reality, she had retained the most useful items while disposing of anything that might have contained evidence of her crimes. Margaret was beginning to understand that Eleanor was not just a killer. She was a student of murder, constantly learning and improving her techniques. Each victim had taught her valuable lessons that she had applied to the next, making her increasingly dangerous and difficult to catch. By now, Margaret was convinced that she was dealing with a serial killer who had operated with impunity in the early Eleanor Blackwood's pattern was becoming clear. She targeted wealthy, older men who were socially prominent but emotionally vulnerable. She married them quickly, gained their trust, convinced them to change their wills, and then eliminated them in ways that appeared natural. Victoria married so place on November 1890. En istom auténticamente este drops, Eleanor Priscablasveig, when Hodge Harrison Blackwood, one of the most powerful men in the state. Hodge Blackwood was a widower in his early 60s, known for his stern demeanor on the bench and his impeccable reputation in the community. He had been married for 30 years to his first wife, who had died of influenza in 19. Eleanor's courtship of Hodge Blackwood was her most audacious move yet. She had approached him under the pretense of seeking legal advice about managing her inherited estates, and their professional relationship had gradually evolved into something more personal. The judge, still grieving the loss of his beloved first wife, had been susceptible to Eleanor's youth, beauty, and apparent vulnerability. The marriage was a grand affair, befitting the union of those of the city's most prominent figures. Eleanor had now achieved the ultimate social status. She was the wife of a judge, a position that gave her access to the highest levels of society, and more importantly, protection from the kind of scrutiny that might have exposed her previous crimes. Margera found it particularly chilling that Eleanor had taken the judge's surname, becoming Eleanor Blackwood. It was as if he was claiming ownership, not just of have a wealthy los status, but of important identity. The woman who asserted as a poor girl with no family name to speak of had now assumed the identity of only the one of most respected families in the region. Hodge Blackwood's death on March 27, 1931 was the most shocking yet. Unlike her previous victims, the judge was a public figure whose every move was scrutinized by the press and the legal community. Eleanor could not afford to have this ataro as a fetches pies, so she had to become more apace than bear reproach. The official causes of death was listed as stroke, which was believable for a man of the judge's age and the stress of his position. However, Margaret's investigation revealed several disturbing details that had been overlooked at the time. Hodge Blackwood had been in excellent health for his age, with no history of cardiovascular problems. His physician, Dr. James Morrison, the same doctor who had attended Dr. Whitmore, had noted that Dr. Whitmore had noted that vantaskubic som bilagerash que Strages Blackwood's funeral, but the Whitmore is not persuaded sopo Whitmore, there's no reforiul of an Eleanor's truna piambos, what cup to bednolis tuos, to boscas cup rembos, te tido valadompa de Havel. Juvenadium telodescofei, was de cavilum shonila Cesar Blackwood, banal armorse fide común con de pimbo tobel tibeta, donco por somi, gigun por somi, a tempo da que fanit vompas valis no republic of mada, tomo tomis la tree, val huerto valison. Teseftasopparen en biketsulen, boroplobula o la metera mutikon por la fan que metiobaden un chikon dikon por la fan vampel actires fi, bedaviendo tamulto pimdarike la stegenchif, querido plobula boste betifanada vieta par la boges monoshoniti, un gratificase di biltabi que metera busheis tot scanner por la voz kenori do probura boste volca betapia marica, domitolovius optipion de yotobo de scan ganyonos. Perhaps is legal tronama le abiometos pesígenas, or perhaps is ohomibico ruiner for media mecopolitan droner for markaboli fabans. Whatever the reason, is ohorat lineal rid of the medial kisankofol comamere widuita. Mas Garrett discovered the Hodge Blackwood had initially resisted Eleanor's suggestions about updating his estate planning. His will left the majority of his wealth to various legal charities and educational institutions, compromisos para Eleanor toward generous but not overwhelming. And in the final weeks of his life, as his health began to decline, Tabanard agreed to make Eleanor his primary beneficiary. The timing of the will change was crucial. Hodge Blackwood has signed the new will on March 15, 1921, just 1 week before his death, according to the witnesses. He seemed confused and disoriented during the signing, complaining of headaches and difficulty concentrating. Dr. Morrison attributed these symptoms to the stress of the enraged heavy caseload, but Margaret suspected something far more sinister. The probate records show that opium to the enraged Blackwood's estate was the largest yet, in addition to aquestos pensables investments en un diomenoforme king fetin for fidelfiglo. In no mention on Elm Street, where Margaret had discovered the photographs, Eleanor had inherited not just wealth, but also real estate holdings that continued to generate income for decades to come. But most importantly, Eleanor had inherited the judge's reputation and social standing. As his widow, she was now considered one of the most respectable women in the community, above suspicion and beyond reproach. She had to achieve the level of social protection you could shield from any future investigation as past. Margaret realized that the photograph from 1921 must have been taken shortly after Hodge Blackwood's funeral. The Nima was of Eleanor standing beside 3 coffins was not just a macabre trophy, it was a celebration of her success. She had systematically eliminated 3 men, inherited her combined wealth, and established herself as one of the most powerful women in the region. The fact that someone written the truth must never be told on the back of the photograph suggested that Eleanor had not been entirely successful in covering her tracks. Someone had known the truth about her crimes, but they had chosen to hide the evidence rather than expose her. Margaret wondered cucata person motavia ben, and ya parathaidu decided to protect Eleanor's secret. The courtship of Hodge Blackwood had required all of Eleanor's skills and patience. The courtship of Hodge Blackwood had required all of Eleanor's skills and patience. Unlike her previous victims, the Hodge was not easily swayed by emotion or charm. He was a man of law and logic, accustomed to examining evidence and questioning motives. Eleanor had to be far more subtle in her approach, building trust slowly and carefully over many months. Eleanor had begun by establishing herself as a vadomelial legal client, seeking the judge's advice on complex estate matters related to her previous inheritances. She had demonstrated impressive knowledge of legal and financial matters, earning his respect as well as his attention. The professional relation of paraboromado complex, poronaje ben correspondentun, yaje ben cobado yude complex to prevangin zamao. Darum kene coruandi dijo mostit, Dorum na provisione por un hielo, en often bodo de complex, tomó fonte lambenaunor de previsiones, tatrumo jazz, vieno complex estate matters, personal, the judge's colleagues denoted agisim to fin nu purpose, and energy after beginning his relationship with Eleanor. He has spoken of her intelligence and compassion, and had credited her with helping him emerge from the deep depression that had followed his first wife's death. Many had seen their marriage as a positive development that would bring happiness to a man who had suffered great loss. Eleanor's challenge with Hodge Blackwood was that he was far more observant and analytical than her previous victims. She chose to be extremely careful not to reveal any inconsistencies in her story or to display knowledge that would seem inappropriate for someone of her supposed background. The Hodge Blackwood Doodle, the Hodge Blackwood Doodle, the Hodge Blackwood Doodle, his obscene obsajarza. The huge resistance to changing his will had forced Eleanor to be more patient than ever before. She had to wait for the right moment when his mental faculties were compromised enough to make him malleable, but not so obviously impaired as to invalidate the legal document. The timing had to be perfect, and Eleanor had demonstrated remarkable skill in orchestrating the circumstances. Margaret was struck by the evolution of Eleanor's methods with each victim. Seal need for experience, becoming po sophisticated, nel ti careful o dato subspecific, kinem brownesing, ter presubod mo puliere, de carpo no, poso ameteru mentium politiulo, copos adisive e piguempla. The tres coffins in the images were not just symbols of her victims, but monuments of her own transformational story, nobody to somebody, through the most extreme impossible. Margaret's discovery of Eleanor Blackwood's pattern of deadly marriages had consumed her thoughts for weeks. As an attorney, she understood the importance of building a solid case, even for crimes that had occurred over a century ago. She decided to dig deeper into the medical records and witness testimonies from the truth, hoping to find evidentes que many overlooked by the authorities of the 1920s. El porta hasta provinto de un Tijuana to teina to the Opoludariqua, to vinto the 1920s. Dr. James Morrison's name appeared frequently in the medical records from that period. He was a prominent physician who had treated many of the city's elite families, and his detailed notes provided valuable insights into the medical practices of the era. Margaret was particularly interested in his records of treating Eleanor's three husbands during their final illnesses. The medical notes for Thomas Ashford revealed a pattern of symptoms that had puzzled Dr. Whitmore at the time. Thomas had complained of severe stomach pain, nausea, and weakness que command suddenly and worsened rapidly. Dr. Whitmore had initially suspected food poisoning, but when the symptoms persisted and intensified, he had been at a loss to explain the cause. Comandadolas mentioned que Eleanor had been exceptionally attentivo during Thomas's illness, preparing all his meals and administering his medications personally. Dr. Whitmore's own medical records, written by Dr. Morrison, told a similar story. The doctor experienced chest pain and shortness of breath that had developed over several weeks. Dr. Morrison told a similar estos symptoms were unusual for a man of Dr. Whitmore's age and fitness level, but he had attributed them to stress and overwork. Again, Eleanor had been described as a devoted wife who had taken complete charge of her husband's care during his illness. Hodges Blackwood's medical records were the most detailed, perhaps because Dr. Morrison had been more thorough in genente case y Josué esta prominente pacient. De Gilco, a Dr. Morrison had severe headaches, confusion, y como Dr. Morrison had describado episodios of disorientation. De Gilco barben sur episodio por gomelcam, momedia en de bunobar inja de los todo por disolvari. Margaret notation en tiempos cases, de kilcomadia minellos todo varios natural causes. More importantly, on Icate's case, Eleanor is dobia primary caregiver, responsibly preparing meals and administering medications. She had all pobia automo to discover each body, claiming to have found her husbands after they had collapsed suddenly. The final piece of evidence Margaret uncovered would expose the shocking truth behind the 1921 photograph and reveal how Eleanor Blackwood had gotten away with the perfect crimes. Margaret's breakthrough came when she discovered a collection of letters hidden in Dr. Morrison's personal papers, which had been donated to the medical archives by his family decades after his death. The letters revealed that Dr. Morrison had harbored serious suspicions about Eleanor Blackwood, but had been unable to prove his theories. In a letter dated April 1901, just weeks after Judge Blackwood's death, Dr. Morrison had written a colloque in Oñodo City. I fear I have been witness to something terrible, but I lack the evidences to prove my suspicions. The widow Blackwood has now lost 3 husbands under circumstances that, while appearing natural, follow a pattern that disturbs me greatly. Each man died after a brief illness characterized by symptoms that could be explained by various causes, yet the rapidity and similarity of the claims suggested something more sinister. The letter went on to describe Dr. Morrison's attempts to investigate the deaths more thoroughly. He had requested permission to perform autopsies on both Dr. Whitmore and George Blackwood, but Eleanor had refused, citing religious objections and her desire to lay her husbands to rest quickly. As the grieving widow, her wishes had been respected, and the bodies had been buried without further examination. Dr. Morrison had also trasladado a nilazimpenisama de medicazione pen prescribda de victims, para que pasette de victims, per comentam estaquel y a malozaldo la esto posiram ma decenares por convetanzara, pues hay tiri primor torjopayas, y como da que esto Morrison pesi prueba conviado victims, los indique la son pecto de Vicenda, los peloc, los redornet dice convit con análisis da patrifolies la. Plus a month beguiled though Dr. Morrison's description of Eleanor's behavior during her husband's illnesses. While she had appeared to be a devoted and caring wife to outside observers, Dr. Morrison had noticed subtle signs that to trouble him. She had been unusual quantum composed during medical crises, showing none of the panic or desperation que no would have expected from a loving spouse. She era vuelta capada de lo spell. The final letter in the collection, dated May 1921, revealed Dr. Morrison's ultimate decision. I have concluded that I cannot prove my suspicions without risking my own reputation and career. Mrs. Blackwood has become too powerful and well-connected to challenge without absolute proof. I have decided to document my concerns for posterity in the hope that someday the truth will be revealed. I pray that I'm wrong about her. Parafiera que se es a woman capable of her grato me simbo disguised as grato me beauty. Margaret realized that Dr. Morrison had been the one who had written the truth must never be told on the back of the photograph. He had known the truth about Eleanor's screams, but he had lacked the courage or evidence to expose her. Instead, Elfiden compró fotografan de quello piquelaundas de la bócimos, ome todo y los tuxiatid la lomo do filmdar. Nelle presmabite la genial details about Eleanor's behavior that had raised Dr. Morrison's suspicions. He had noted that she had an unusual interest in medical texts and had asked detailed questions about various diseases and their symptoms. Se ha todo me remarkably well informed that the effects of better defects of different medications and can just existed traspentopes pasa fomo physical to preparation without medication. Dr. Morrison igitable on both, Eleanor's grief seemed performative rather than genuine. While she had displayed all the appropriate outward signs of mourning, he had noticed that her sorrow seemed to disappear when she thought no one was watching. Ea caught glimpses a satisfaction and calculation in her expression y cabiendo distorted timid. Perhaps most telling was Dr. Morrison's observation Eleanor had shown an unusual interest in the financial affairs of her dying husbands. She had been present during discussions about their estates and had asked detailed questions about inheritance laws and probate procedures. This level of interest to financial matters had seemed inappropriate for a grieving wife, but Eleanor had always managed to frame her questions in terms of concern for her husband's wishes and legacies. The letters also revealed that Dr. Morrison had attempted to warn other prominent men in the community about Eleanor, but his efforts had been unsuccessful. Eleanor's reputation as a tragic and virtuous widow has been so well established to any succession por como confías y doniso guru protectivon para confías es viescam possible majo ancron en base to impossible. Dr. Morrison's decision to hide the evidence rather than pursue his suspicions has been motivated by both fear and pragmatism. He had recognized that Eleanor había mado more so powerful and well-connected the challenge directly. En su suayu sau propetiento penes petinxa trumpieno, y sam no proportation carrier, if he meda que diusasios, he could no prove. His choice to document his suspicions for posterity had been a compromise between his conscience and his self-preservation. Margaret was struck by the tragic irony of Dr. Morrison's situation. He abandoned the few people to recognize Eleanor's true nature. Para beni social structures que el protector Eleanor from suspicion, adjuto preventer 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 Eleanor from through suspicion, adiuto preventer Eleanor 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 through suspicion, adiuto prevent. She now understood not only how Eleanor had committed of crimes, but all of hakiben schemes, but all of hakiben pegeslo, bet escapes tectiena in punishment. Pero combinación de careful planning, social manipulación, and sheer audacity had allowed Eleanor to operate with impunity for years. Margaret's investigation que revealed the pattern of Eleanor's crimes, but also still needed to understand the method. How had Eleanor managed to kill 3 men without leaving any trace of evidence que would have been detectable by the medical knowledge of 1920? Don puesta pantasinonis el Chekhov's tabi. Eleanor's own background. Digging into Eleanor's past before her first marriage, Margaret discovered that the young woman had not been as innocent and inexperienced as she had appeared. Eleanor Katz conoce de la rural anda que Ramonovra de nadocado con Berio Wenma en ambetunelli nedocal healer. Son boyainto que na osta de qual se levanta viento fodium en son boyetello y lo proborizelia viego. Eleanor Katz conoce de Hasaya Leonazegdo worked briefly as an assistant to a pharmacist in the city before her marriage to Thomas Ashford. This position would have given access to various chemicals and medications, as well as knowledge about how different substances affected the human body. More importantly, it would have the effective turn to panostoses, at account psax the taste and appearance of toxic substances. The breakthrough in understanding Eleanor's method came when Margaret consulted with a modern toxicologist about the symptoms described in the medical records. Sarah Chen, a forensic expert, reviewed the documented symptoms of all Trice victims in order to identify the lodos ghosts. Based on these symptoms and the timeline you've described, Dr. Chen explained, I would suspect arsenic poisoning. Arsenic was readily available in the early 20th century and was used in various household products, including rat poison and certain medications. The symptoms you've described, gastric distress, weakness, confusion, and cardiovascular problems are all consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. Dr. Chen went on to explain that arsenic poisoning could be administered gradually over time, making it appear as if the victim was suffering from a natural illness. The poison was tasteless and odorless when properly prepared, and small doses administered regularly would cause symptoms that could easily be attributed to other causes. Most importantly, arsenic poisoning would not have been detectable by the medical tests available on Eleanor would have had to be very knowledgeable about dosages. Dr. Chen continued, too much too quickly would cause obvious poisoning symptoms that would have raised suspicions. But administered gradually in small amounts, arsenic would cause a slow decline that would appear to be a natural illness. The fact that she was preparing all their meals and administering their medications would have given her perfect opportunities to deliver the poison. Margaret realized that Eleanor's background in herbal medicine and her experience working in a pharmacy had given her the perfect combination of knowledge and access to carry out her crimes. She would have known exactly how much arsenic to use and how to administer it without detection. Her role as a caring wife would have provided the perfect cover for her activities. The toxicologist also explained that arsenic poisoning could cause different symptoms depending on how it was administered and the victim's individual physiology. This would explain why Thomas Ashford had suffered primarily from gastric symptoms, while Dr. Whitmore had experienced cardiac problems, and Judge Blackwood had shown neurological symptoms. Eleanor had likely adjusted her method based on her observations of how each victim responded to the poison. Margaret was struck by the calculated nature of Eleanor's crimes. She had not acted in passion or desperation, but had methodically planned and executed each murder with scientific precision. The young woman, who had appeared to be a grieving widow, was actually a cold-blooded killer, who had used her knowledge of medicine and chemistry to commit the perfect crimes. The photograph from 1901 took on new meaning in light of this discovery. Eleanor, standing beside the three coffins, was not just a macabre trophy. It was the portrait of a woman who had successfully used science and society's expectations to commit murder on an unprecedented scale. She had turned the very institutions that were supposed to protect people, marriage, medicine, and the law, into weapons for her own advancement. Margaret wondered how many other women like Eleanor might have operated throughout history, using their knowledge of herbs and chemicals to eliminate inconvenient husbands or rivals. The early 20th century had been a time when women had limited opportunities for advancement, but Eleanor had found a way to transcend those limitations through the most extreme means possible. The more Margaret learned about arsenic poisoning, the more she understood why Eleanor had chosen this particular method. Arsenic had been known as the inheritance powder for centuries because of its effectiveness in eliminating wealthy relatives. It was readily available, difficult to detect, and could be administered in ways that appeared completely innocent. Eleanor's knowledge of herbal medicine had given her additional advantages. She would have known how to prepare arsenic in ways that masked its presence and how to combine it with other substances to enhance its effects. Her grandmother's teachings about plant-based remedies had provided her with a foundation of knowledge that she had twisted to deadly purpose. The pharmacy where Eleanor had worked had likely provided her with access to pure arsenic compounds that would have been more potent and reliable than the arsenic found in household products. Her position as an assistant would have given her opportunities to learn about proper storage, handling, and dosing of toxic substances without arousing suspicion. Margaret realized that Eleanor's choice of victims had been influenced by her method as well as her goals. Older men were more likely to experience health problems that could mask the symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Their age and social status also made them less likely to be subjected to thorough medical examinations that might have revealed the true cause of their illnesses. Eleanor's timing had been crucial to her success. She had administered the poison slowly enough to avoid acute symptoms that would have immediately suggested poisoning, but quickly enough to prevent her victims from becoming suspicious or seeking second opinions about their mysterious illnesses. The balance required to achieve this timing demonstrated a level of expertise that was truly chilling. The fact that Eleanor had disposed of all medications immediately after each death now made perfect sense. She had been eliminating evidence that might have contained traces of arsenic or other toxic substances. Her claim that she could not bear to keep reminders of her husband's suffering had provided a plausible explanation for behavior that was actually designed to cover her tracks. Margaret was beginning to understand that Eleanor had been far more than just a serial killer. She had been a criminal mastermind who had combined scientific knowledge, social manipulation, and psychological insight to create a nearly perfect system for committing murders. The fact that she had operated successfully for years without detection was a testament to her intelligence and planning abilities. With the mystery of Eleanor's method solved, Margaret turned her attention to what had happened to the killer. The photograph suggested that Eleanor had achieved her ultimate goal. She had eliminated 3 husbands, inherited their combined wealth, and established herself as one of the most powerful women in the region. But what had she done with that power, and how had her story ended? The trail of Eleanor Blackwood, after 1921, proved to be surprisingly difficult to follow. Unlike her previous activities, which had been well documented due to her marriages and social prominence, Eleanor seemed to have deliberately obscured her later life. Margaret suspected that the woman had learned to be more careful about leaving evidence of her activities. Property records showed that Eleanor had maintained ownership of Judge Blackwood's mansion on Elm Street, but she had also acquired several other properties throughout the region. She had invested wisely in real estate, stocks, and business ventures, multiplying her inherited wealth many times over. By the mid-1920s, she had become one of the wealthiest individuals in the state, with a financial empire that spanned multiple industries. What was most interesting to Margaret was that Eleanor had never remarried after Judge Blackwood's death. Given her pattern of using marriage as a means to acquire wealth and status, this seemed like a significant change in behavior. Margaret theorized that Eleanor had finally achieved enough wealth and power that she no longer needed to rely on husbands to advance her position. Instead, Eleanor had channeled her energies into business and philanthropy. She had established several charitable foundations, funded medical research, and supported various social causes. On the surface, she appeared to have transformed herself from a grieving widow into a respected philanthropist and businesswoman. The community that had once pitied her for her tragic losses now admired her for her strength and generosity. But Margaret suspected that Eleanor's philanthropic activities served a dual purpose. In addition to genuinely helping various causes, they also provided perfect cover for her past crimes. Who would suspect a woman who donated generously to hospitals and medical research of having murdered 3 doctors and judges? Eleanor had essentially bought herself immunity through her charitable works. Margaret found evidence that Eleanor had been particularly generous to medical institutions, funding research into the very types of illnesses that had killed her husband. She had established scholarships for medical students, donated equipment to hospitals, and supported research into heart disease, stroke, and gastric disorders. It was a masterful stroke of misdirection. Eleanor was funding research into the very conditions she had artificially created in her victims. The most chilling discovery was that Eleanor had also funded the construction of a new wing at the city hospital, which had been named in honor of Dr. Marcus Whitmore, her second husband. The dedication ceremony had been attended by hundreds of people, including many prominent physicians and city officials. Eleanor had given a moving speech about her late husband's dedication to medicine and her desire to continue his legacy through her charitable giving. Margaret realized that Eleanor had not just gotten away with murder, she had turned her crimes into a source of social capital. Every charitable donation, every foundation she established, every scholarship she funded served to reinforce her image as a tragic but noble woman who had overcome great personal losses to help others. She had weaponized sympathy and transformed herself from a killer into a saint. The records showed that Eleanor had lived a long and apparently prosperous life, dying in her obituary published in newspapers throughout the region, described her as a pure, the community whose generosity and strength in the face of personal tragedy inspired generations. There was no mention of the suspicious circumstances surrounding her 3 marriages, no hint of the dark secrets that had funded her philanthropic empire. Eleanor had been buried in the city's most prestigious cemetery in an elaborate mausoleum that she had commissioned years before her death. The inscription read, "Eleanor Blackwood, beloved wife, generous benefactor, inspiration to all." Even in death, she had maintained the carefully constructed image that had protected her throughout her life. Margaret was struck by the completeness of Eleanor's transformation. The young woman who had systematically murdered 3 men had successfully reinvented herself as a beloved community leader. She had not just escaped justice, she had turned her crimes into the foundation for a legacy of apparent virtue and generosity. Eleanor's business acumen had proven to be as impressive as her criminal skills. She had diversified her investments across multiple industries, including textiles, real estate, banking, and manufacturing. Her wealth had continued to grow throughout her life, making her one of the most financially powerful individuals in the region. She had used this economic influence to shape local politics and social policies, always positioning herself as a champion of progressive causes. The charitable foundations that Eleanor had established had continued to operate long after her death, providing ongoing benefits to the community while simultaneously preserving her positive reputation. These institutions had become monuments to her supposed virtue, making it even more difficult for anyone to question her past or investigate her crimes. Margaret discovered that Eleanor had been remarkably strategic in her philanthropy, focusing on causes that would generate maximum positive publicity while also serving her own interests. Her support for medical research had not only provided cover for her crimes, but had also given her access to cutting-edge medical knowledge that she could have used for future criminal activities if necessary. Eleanor's transformation from killer to philanthropist had been so complete that she had become a role model for other wealthy women of her era. She had been featured in magazines and newspapers as an example of how personal tragedy could be transformed into social good. Her story had inspired countless others to engage in charitable work, creating a positive legacy that was built on a foundation of murder and deception. The irony of Eleanor's later life was not lost on Margaret. The woman who had killed 3 men in pursuit of wealth and status had ultimately achieved a level of respect and admiration that far exceeded anything she could have gained through her crimes alone. Her transformation demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that was truly remarkable, even as it was deeply disturbing. Margaret realized that Eleanor's story was not just about murder, it was about the power of reinvention and the way that wealth and social position could be used to rewrite history. Eleanor had not just escaped punishment for her crimes. She had turned those crimes into the foundation for a completely new identity that was celebrated rather than condemned. As Margaret sat in her office, surrounded by the evidence of Eleanor Blackwood's crimes, she faced a profound moral dilemma. She had uncovered the truth about 3 murders that had gone unpunished for over a century, but the killer was long dead, and her victims had been buried for decades. What purpose would be served by exposing Eleanor's crimes now? The legal implications were clear. There could be no prosecution of a woman who had died in 9. The statute of limitations had long since expired, even if it had applied to murder cases. From a purely legal standpoint, Margaret's investigation had been an academic exercise with no practical consequences. But Margaret understood that justice was about more than legal proceedings. The families of Eleanor's victims deserved to know the truth about how their relatives had died. The community that had celebrated Eleanor as a philanthropist and role model deserved to understand the true source of her wealth and generosity. And perhaps most importantly, the historical record needed to be corrected to reflect the reality of what had happened in those crucial years of the early 90s. Margaret decided to contact the descendants of Eleanor's victims, starting with the Ashford family. Thomas Ashford's great-nephew, Robert Ashford, was a retired professor living in California. When Margaret called to explain her discoveries, his reaction was one of shock, followed by a strange sense of relief. "I always wondered about Uncle Thomas's death," Robert told her. "My grandfather used to say that something wasn't right about how quickly he declined after his marriage. The family had suspicions, but they could never prove anything, and Eleanor was so well connected that no one wanted to challenge her publicly." Similar conversations with descendants of Whitmore and Judge Blackwood revealed that suspicions about Eleanor had persisted within the families for generations. Each family had their own version of whispered doubts and unanswered questions that had been passed down through the decades. Margaret's investigation had finally provided the answers they had been seeking for over a century. The decision about whether to make her findings public was more complex. Margaret consulted with historians, ethicists, and legal experts about the implications of exposing Eleanor's crimes so long after the fact. The consensus was that the historical importance of the case outweighed any potential harm to Eleanor's reputation or the institutions she had supported. Margaret worked with a team of historians and journalists to prepare a comprehensive report on Eleanor's crimes. The report included all the evidence she had gathered, expert analysis of the likely murder methods, in context about the social and legal conditions that had allowed Eleanor to operate with impunity. The goal was not sensationalism, but rather a serious examination of how a serial killer had exploited the systems and expectations of her time. The publication of Margaret's findings created a sensation in both academic and popular circles. The story of Eleanor Blackwood became a case study in criminal psychology, gender studies, and legal history. Universities used the case to examine how social expectations and gender roles could be manipulated by criminals, while law enforcement agencies studied Eleanor's methods as an example of how killers could exploit gaps in investigative procedure. Perhaps most importantly, the revelation led to a re-examination of Eleanor's philanthropic legacy. Several institutions that bore her name or had been funded by her donations chose to acknowledge the dark source of her wealth while continuing to honor the positive impact of her charitable works. It was a complex moral calculation that reflected the complicated nature of Eleanor's legacy. The photograph from 1921 was eventually displayed in a museum exhibition about crime and justice in American history. The image of Eleanor standing beside the three coffins served as a powerful reminder of how appearances could be deceiving and how evil could hide behind a mask of respectability and social standing. Margaret's investigation had taken months to complete, but it had provided closure to families who had waited over a century for answers. More importantly, it had ensured that the truth about Eleanor Blackwood's crimes would not be lost to history. The woman who had thought she had committed the perfect murders had finally been exposed, even if justice could no longer be served in a traditional sense. As Margaret filed away the last of the documents related to the case, she reflected on the lessons of Eleanor's story. The case demonstrated how social expectations and gender stereotypes could be weaponized by those with criminal intent. It showed how wealth and social standing could provide protection from scrutiny and investigation. And it proved that sometimes the most dangerous criminals were those who appeared most respectable and sympathetic. The shocking photograph from 1921 had indeed revealed its secrets, but those secrets served as a warning about the dangers of assuming that evil always looks evil, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless. Eleanor Blackwood's story was finally complete, but its lessons would endure for generations to come. The impact of Margaret's revelations extended far beyond the immediate families of Eleanor's victims. The case sparked discussions about the historical treatment of suspicious deaths, the evolution of forensic science, and the ways in which social biases could interfere with criminal investigation. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing cold cases from similar time periods, looking for patterns that might have been missed by investigators who were influenced by the social prejudices of their era. The story also highlighted the importance of preserving historical records and the value of persistent investigation. Margaret's discovery had been made possible by the careful documentation, Morrison, and the preservation of medical and legal records that might easily have been discarded over the decades. The case became an argument for maintaining comprehensive historical archives and for the continued investigation of unsolved crimes, regardless of their age. Eleanor's story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing wealth and social status to shield individuals from scrutiny, the very factors that had made Eleanor's victims attractive targets. Their prominence, wealth, and social standing had also made it difficult for authorities to investigate their deaths thoroughly. The case demonstrated how criminal justice systems could be compromised by social hierarchies and class distinctions. The revelation of Eleanor's crimes also raised questions about the nature of justice and the possibility of redemption. While Eleanor's latter philanthropic works had undoubtedly benefited many people, they had been funded by the proceeds of murder. The institutions she had supported faced difficult decisions about how to acknowledge this history while continuing to honor the positive impact of her donations. Margaret's investigation had begun with a simplest inventory, but it had evolved into something much more significant. A comprehensive examination of how a serial killer had operated within the social and legal structures of the early days. The case would continue to be studied by criminologists, historians, and legal scholars for years to come, serving as a reminder that the pursuit of truth and justice should never be abandoned, regardless of how much time has passed. The photograph from 1921, once hidden in a dusty attic, had finally fulfilled its purpose as evidence of Eleanor Blackwood's crimes. The woman who had posed so confidently beside the coffins of her victims had ultimately been exposed by the very image she had commissioned to celebrate her success. In the end, Eleanor's honor, vanity, and need for recognition had provided the key to solving the mystery of her perfect crimes.